everyone here on behalf of Princeton Club of India. Especially like to thank our speaker, Dr. Ramaswami, for joining us today, all the way from Princeton, New Jersey. Dr. Ramaswamy is going to talk about urban life and urban policy issues post the COVID pandemic's, introduction into our world. I'd like to thank especially the Indian Chamber of Commerce for being our hosts and partners for this event today. And I'd like to request the president of the Indian Chamber and polyglot in in almost all senses of the word, Mr. Mayank Jalan, to please, formally welcome Dr. Ramaswamy and all our guests today. Over to you, Mayank.
So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Ramaswamy, and all our attendees. I really hope that all of you are staying safe and well. The really exciting thing about the event today is the topic itself, reimagining. I think over the last 40 days, 60 days, all across the world, we've been forced to reimagine the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we handle ourselves at home and at office with our colleagues. And I think today is the time when we also should start thinking that how will we be post-COVID-19? A lot of things would have fundamentally changed forever. Would we be as social as we were? Would we actually be able to live in extremely congested high rises? A few years back, I was in Hong Kong, and one of the presentations I was shown that the only solution to urban infrastructure is to go vertically up. But today, when we're actually talking about social distancing, is that really the future? Is vertical rise really the future? And many such issues, I'm sure that Professor Ramaswamy will be addressing during a talk. So I don't want to take a lot of time. Formally welcome to all of you from Indian Chamber of Commerce. It's an absolute honor to have Professor Ramaswamy with us. Back to you, Siddhant.
Thanks, Mayank. We're all looking forward now to today's main event. Dr. Ramaswamy is a professor of environmental and civil engineering at Princeton. She's also the Sanjay Swani professor for global issues. And she is also the inaugural director of Princeton's Chadha Center for Global India. So she's an extremely talented and insightful researcher, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say, Professor. Over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this platform to talk about my work and also the Chadha Center. So I want to thank both Shiv Kaul and Mayank Jalan for your kind introductions. And maybe I'll just launch straight into this.
Sure, go ahead. We can't wait.
All right. So I think if you let me know if the slideshow works, and I'll just begin with a few slides and then we can open up for some discussion. So just if the slideshow works.
That's great. Yep.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
I think.
So as Mayank introduced us, life has changed completely. And this question is, how do we think about India and Indian cities and cities all over the world post-COVID? And by way of introduction, I thought I would introduce both the MS Chadha Center for Global India and the Sustainable Healthy Cities Network, which I lead out of Princeton University. So you get a flavor of what I do. And so today's talk is just going to be a brief introduction to the background of my work, then some background on COVID itself, and then looking to the future with this idea of how do we build back better. And so if we can go to the next slide, brief introduction to the Chadha Center for Global India. The mission of the Chadha Center is to look at interactions between India and the world that have potential to transform human and planetary well-being and our imaginaries of the human experience. So we're striving to be a center that's novel in looking not only within India, but the linkages of India with the rest of the world. And the COVID is actually one example that's actually connecting all of us globally. But it's not only COVID, our focus is on different types of projects, for example, urbanization in India and the world, new visions of literature, art, and music at the intersection between India and the world, technology leapfrogging. But today I'm going to talk about urbanization and this topic that Mayank and Shiv introduced. I just wanted to just raise a shout out to the center and invite you to visit our website. This picture is actually from the Swani lecture last summer, where students come to India from Princeton and spend 6 weeks doing an intensive study. I also am the lead PI and director of a network called the Sustainable Healthy Cities Network, which is across 8 US universities, several universities and partners in India, as well as cities both in India and the US. And this is our website. If you have further questions, I invite you to visit the website. And the focus of our network is really looking at infrastructure, integrated infrastructure actions in diverse cities, in nations globally. So you'll see some data that I'll share from India. We've also studied cities in China and cities in the US, with the goal being to compare and contrast these urban experiences. And our focus as such is on these 7 key provisioning systems. And we know them because we depend on them. And these are buildings, energy, food, green infrastructure and public spaces, water, waste, and mobility, and their interactions. And what we're looking at is how these systems affect multiple outcomes. And so that's what's unique. Often you find groups might focus on just the environment. We're looking at sustainability as a whole. So we're looking at human well-being, happiness in cities, health, environment, equity, livability, and their co-benefits and trade-offs. And we look at pathways, which is really interesting for us to think of as we think of building back better. What are the pathways of change? And these could be technology and design innovations. These could be spatial reconfiguration. How do we think of infrastructure? Should it be centralized or distributed? We could think of business and finance innovations, policy, as well as behavioral change and their integration. And I'm going to touch upon these themes today. So the next slide is just an example of recent events. As Shiv noted, I'm the inaugural faculty director of the center. We had our first conference online because of the COVID back in March. We also have a new grant looking at urban food systems with potential and interest in partnering with cities in India. So just really quickly, I wanted to give you some background on COVID in urban India. This is not new to folks in India, but for those from the US that are listening in, this is good context. So in terms of COVID and health, typically the level of monitoring has been low, but there have been more than 150,000 confirmed cases so far as of 2 days back. Based on Times of India statistics, there are about 4,500 deaths for a very large population of 1.3 billion. And in contrast, in the US, the mortality has exceeded 100,000 over the past day. So the levels in India, if you look on a per capita basis or a per population basis, is much lower compared to the US and Italy. And there are several attributing factors. We don't quite know what those are, but people have talked about demographics, underreporting, people not going to the hospital so much, as well as the prevalence potentially of BCG vaccinations. But all of these are, they're hypotheses. We don't quite know what the reasons are. There have been hotspots. So for example, these 5 cities, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Delhi, Chennai, and Pune, have accounted for about 60% of the cases, which is a vast majority. And COVID has also, of course, affected economy and jobs, not only in India, all over the world. In India, we were already going through a slowdown before COVID. And post-COVID, 2/3 of Indian workers have lost their jobs, and the earnings have also been cut by 60% for those who still have them. And these are statistics that came out in a new article in Science. And then COVID and inequality, we see this, the difficulties that daily wage earners and migrant workers are disproportionately impacted. Many of you might have seen or participated in the I for India campaign. So I know there's been a lot of visibility on these topics. Social distancing and hand washing is also really difficult when large urban populations in cities don't have access to basic services. And we'll see some data on that. And then a lot of this food insecurity has been raised by many cities, not only in India, but in the US and all over. In addition to access to healthcare. So that's sort of the background of COVID itself. And here are some data, and these are from papers from my research group over the years. But this is just to give some context. This is the Census of India, the previous census, from a paper we had published, but you get a sense in 10 cities. You know, if we talk about hand washing, getting water from a treated source, you can see fairly large proportions in these various cities don't have access. While this has improved, it still remains a challenge. You know, closed drainage, permanent structure. And so these are systemic issues that we have to think of as we think of urban India. And I also wanted to talk about inequality in consumption. And particularly one statistic that we may not know of is floor area. So we're quite, in terms of, if you look at floor area, housing floor area per household, the red dotted line here and the black dotted line here represent international and Indian standards. And these standards are based on transmission of diseases, respiratory diseases like COVID, but also tuberculosis. So these standards were established based on public health. And here you can see the per household floor area by socioeconomic strata. So you can see the bottom 10%, 20%, 30%, etc. And you can see that a vast majority of the population, so ranging from 50 to 60%, is living in floor areas that are below what is recommended for public health. And so when we think about overcrowding, this really tells you it's not only density is just one thing, it's also just the floor area available per capita. And so this question of how do we address this, maybe not just for COVID, but for disease spreading in general, is a question that I think we should address. We see similar patterns in electricity use. And again, this is not just India. There was an excellent paper published in Nature recently by my colleague Julia Steinberger and her colleagues out of UK, and they did a global analysis. And you can see this type of effects where the top 20 to 40%, their consumption is several factors higher than the bottom 50%. And so here you see the same data. You see the population that has less than 8.75 meters square per capita floor area. It's quite high. And this has been a trend based on consumer surveys and the National Sample Survey. And you can see the ratios here, the 80 percentile versus the 20 percentile. Some of these ratios are approaching 10, 5 to 10. So factor of 5 to 10 higher. So when we think of environmental impacts, it's also good to think of where we don't have access, where we don't have either sufficient floor area or sufficient infrastructure for hand washing. That's so important for addressing disease spreading. So I think what has been interesting is what has happened to the environment during the lockdown. And again, I don't need to show these pictures because I think all of you have seen this, but I wanted to cite two articles by my colleague at IIT Kanpur, Professor Sachi Tripathi. One was out in the Hindu, And he provides a lot of data on reduction in PM 2.5 concentrations from March to April. And there was a 44% reduction, and you can visibly see the air getting cleaner. This is really relevant because I think more than 20 of the top 30 polluted cities based on PM 2.5 concentrations are in India. And so when you see clean air, it at least tells us what is possible. You know, how we get there is a key question. How we get there by retaining economic growth is actually the most critical question. But we're talking in Delhi alone, you know, more than 1,000 premature deaths are estimated from air pollution. And so if we can really think about doing this transition from dirty to clean air while retaining our economy, that is sort of the central tenet of sustainable development. The second article talks about municipal solid waste. There was about a 30% reduction as examples. There are data from multiple cities. And so I think this shows what's possible, but also tells us how we get there as we start up the economy is really important. So here's another picture from CNN that merged the before and after photo just to give us a visual look of what's happening. So if we put all this together and we look to the future, I thought I'd just throw out 4 ideas to build back better, and then we can open up for discussion. The first idea is really looking at urban-rural interactions. When we saw photos, videos of all our migrant workers going from cities back to rural areas, coming back to cities now that the lockdown is done, I just thinking about that and thinking about a circular economy that allows exchanges between urban areas more than they're happening now could be potentially beneficial in a number of ways, which I'll talk about. The second is really having to tackle this infrastructure access question and how do we address those inequalities. The third is leveraging insights on consumer behaviors. I showed you some data on consumption, who's consuming, how can we think of nudging consumption, thinking about the benefits to all of us. And then systemic urban infrastructure planning for future cities, recognizing that India is expecting about 400 million new urbanites by the year 2050. So I'll touch upon them briefly, and I think we'll still have time to have some discussions. So the urban-rural interactions, I wanted to just say that if you look at the long term, leveraging, for example, local food supply chains around urban areas in India while managing crop stubble, which is a source of air pollution, and creating waste to value products can be both a technology and an environmental innovation. And we have many of the pieces going on. What's even more interesting is that it takes this idea of Swadeshi or self-reliance. This is actually the recent cover of India Today, which describes the financial stimulus and the vision for self-reliance. But we could also think about that in terms of urban self-reliance. Urban areas can't be self-reliant within their boundary, but their interactions around their surroundings could generate not 100% reliant economy, but a significantly higher economic interaction between urban and surrounding rural areas could help in multiple ways. In the short term, we would also have to address bringing migrant workers back to cities, providing shelter on site for major construction projects as we open up the economy, and invest in infrastructure. So I think these are some ideas. The circular economy idea is now extremely popular and taking root in Europe. There are actual examples in different industries. And I just wanted to share again research from my group that has looked at food supply chains to multiple Indian cities. And you can see most of the supply chains are actually very close. Most of the food is coming from around cities. So there's this potential to connect production and consumption in ways that are economically beneficial. The other benefit of having a robust rural economy or a more robust rural economy around urban areas is that it could help slow down the rate of urban in-migration. So during very fast economic growth, and we've had growth in cities like Rajkot of 10% per annum, and that's a really big number. That means your infrastructure needs double every 7 years. And we know that construction projects, it's very rare that we finish massive construction projects at that pace. And so really slowing down the rate of urban infrastructure and thinking about distributed infrastructure. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, this idea of more localized and distributed infrastructure, thinking of distributed renewable energy, beefing up the food economy. Amul in India is such a great example of what has happened with the milk revolution. Can we do that in ways that apply to other food items? And can we also think of energy in similar scale to address both the carbon and the air pollution issue through renewables? These are, examples where economy and environment come together. So I am social distancing at home, and my dog seems to be barking in the background. So just excuse that. So I want to come back to this topic of trying to address inequalities first by slowing down the rate of in-migration, while also taking care of the migrants that are coming in through commitments to potentially massively scale up the in-situ slum rehabilitation. India has several success cases to bring people in the city, but also provide good housing. This question of whether we develop vertically versus horizontally is a really good one, and I'll address that in a couple of slides. But I did want to say that data from India, from Europe, from China, from South America has looked at what we call superlinear increases. So mostly Europe and US, North America have seen superlinear increase in GDP as city population increases. So if population doubles, GDP more than doubles. But this hasn't been realized to that extent in Indian cities, partly due to transportation infrastructure, and that we don't quite achieve economic equilibrium, spatial equilibrium that we theorize in urban areas. And some of that is theorized to be because of inadequate infrastructure to allow mobility between people and jobs. And so one of the things we could be thinking is retaining folks that come and work in our service economy that are living in slums through in-situ rehabilitation. This is an example in India. There are examples in Ahmedabad where this has been done extremely well. Yeah. And so thinking through those, as these types of vertical rehabilitation reduce material use, they can be designed to provide a higher quality of life, particularly allowing the people who are rehabilitated to engage in the design of their own buildings. This needs caution, care, and respect for how this is done, but India has demonstrated this in many, many, many case studies that could be replicated. The third strategy is thinking of leveraging insights on consumer behavior. So while we talk of people that are having issues with lack of access, there's also the issue of high consumption, particularly as we showed the data. And so what has been successful, and as I said, this is happening worldwide, there have been very well demonstrated successes in behavioral nudging using different types of messaging. So environment could be a message to allow, to encourage consumption, conservation in your consumer behaviors. So you conserve energy. O-Power is a company that is working in the US. It works with electric utilities to send personalized messaging through your utility bills, and has resulted in 3 to 5% electricity reduction just by messaging. People are trying this in the food system to enable diet shifts. It's been tried in multiple sectors and with success. And so this is quite promising. And one opportunity might be to think about actually reminding people about the environmental gains and organizing both public awareness and behavioral nudging campaigns. You could do this through smart devices, through utility bills, to really think about coal-fired electricity reduction from the consumption side while addressing the supply side through renewables. We could think of rethinking work commutes, extending telecommuting for IT and other sectors to reduce traffic. We've done, odd, even regulations, but these could be other opportunities that go on the private sector, not on the policy side. And then the last topic I wanted to talk about was the systemic infrastructure planning for future cities. And so this is a report that I had written with the United Nations Environmental Program with my colleagues Mark Swilling, Serge Salat, and several others. And what we're showing here, based on multiple case studies from several cities all over the world, is that we could plan future cities that could reduce resource use by a factor of 10. So this is really huge, not just half, by a factor of 10, through multiplicative effects of these 4 strategies. And the idea is that you can reduce resource use with better livability. So it's not a trade-off between resource use and economy or resource use and well-being, but it's actually an intersection. And the first in 4 layers that interact together, these 4 levers, the first is absolutely land use. We have to think about land use and making that inclusive. And so to the comment that was made previously, we don't have to be like Hong Kong. We could be 4 stories, 4 or 5 stories like London is. London is a great example of livability with steady density, but the density needs to be accessible, and I'll show you what that means. And studies have shown if you do that steadily over large areas, you can achieve about a 50% reduction in resource use from business as usual. The second is just making single sectors more efficient, having cross-sector symbiosis. You can look at this report, for example, and that can have a further 50% reduction. And then there's behavior and lifestyle change, which I just spoke about. You could potentially get a 50% reduction that way. And the last is renewables. Of course, we could have much more than 20% penetration of renewables. And if you multiply these, the hypothesis is that you could build these future cities that consume much less resources and therefore are systemically better for the environment. In that report, here's an example, of compact inclusive land use. So one thing we want to say is that it's not just density to be thinking of, because if you just look at density, here's Mumbai, it has some of the highest per square kilometer densities. But what we really want could be something like London, which is not as dense, but actually achieves the articulated density we're talking about. So we want access to jobs, walkability, and transit, along with inclusion, so that we are not, we don't see the high levels of inequality and informal development that we're seeing in many cities worldwide. And so here's another example of what articulated density means. This picture that you see on the left side is comparing cities like Barcelona, Paris, here's Pudong in Shanghai, and here's the Beijing towers in China. And this is simply to illustrate that if you just looked at density, the Beijing tower would be a lot of high density, but it isn't porous. If you see here, it isn't porous. It doesn't allow for the interaction between residents and businesses and create what we call articulated density. And what you're seeing is more what you would see in many older European cities and older Indian cities, where you have a finer grid structure that allows this articulated density benefits in access, in transit to be achieved much better than super blocks. So I just wanted to say when we mean density, it's really this steady articulated density that gives you the gains rather than these big super blocks where you really can't go anywhere. So you want the articulated density, and we've shown success here compared to Bangalore and Hyderabad. Ahmedabad with far-thinking urban planning had much less sprawl over a 10-year period than Hyderabad and Bangalore saw. So we've had examples in India where we've achieved this. So I want to come back to the last level. I've talked about compact and inclusive land use. I've talked about behavior. And this idea of distributed renewables could potentially be really game-changing for multiple types of resiliences. So we just talked about the hurricane in Calcutta and Eastern India. And so having more distributed infrastructure can build in resilience and thinking about not only COVID, but how we think forward in terms of more local and distributed infrastructure can provide multiple opportunities. So with that, I'm going to thank you all, and I can come back to these questions that were raised. Maybe we can stop here for discussion. But the questions were, these are some of the questions that were asked. What will the long-term impact of the COVID pandemic be? It really depends, I think, on us. It depends on how we build back better. Do we do urban-rural circular economies so that we slow down the rate of urban in-migration? Do we help rural areas become having more jobs so that this impetus to move to urban areas at such a high rate is reduced? That may be beneficial. And so some of it is policy, but a lot of it is also how we as communities think about our cities. It's the public sector, the private sector, and policymakers and communities coming together. In terms of technologies, here are a few examples that we're looking at in the US. Can we monitor wastewater? Again, this can be challenging in India, as I mentioned. 40–50% of some cities don't have access to sewerage systems, but sewerage monitoring for COVID has been proposed and has actually been shown as a technology of the future. We've already been doing contact tracing, and Arogya Setu is one that has been released and has already got a lot of participation in India. Privacy protections are important. This idea of long-term social resilience, which is not only about technology, but how information flows within our cities, is really key, recognizing that we have vulnerabilities, various vulnerabilities. Some may be physical if you're on the coast, some may be social vulnerabilities. And I hope I shared with you some of the best practices from different parts of the world that I've illustrated in my presentation. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to Shiv leading the way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramaswamy. That was a very detailed and brilliant presentation. And I think we've had a lot of requests on the chat and also to me privately requesting if that can be shared. So if that is possible to be shared, I'll request your office to send it to us either at PCI or the chamber, and we'll give it to the members who are interested. Dr. Ramaswamy, this was a very remarkable presentation. It's very lucidly, I think, put together the history of urbanization in India, and you've explored also, what you think are the ways forward. In that line, I think to me the most striking issue that was raised was that slide about the quote unquote new cities and the old cities, and how in many ways the old cities got this concept of interactions as key to making a city survive. And we need to juxtapose that in some way by using technology to make sure that that pace of interactions, the density of interactions, continues as we try and create what you refer to as the urban-rural circular economy or circular interaction. So we need to find a way to get the rural belts of urban India involved in those interactions. So, how can how can we achieve that? To my mind, obviously, transport is a very critical part of that. But I think perhaps with technology and communications, there's a way to bypass that. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that before we take some more of the questions that have come up.
Yes. So I think both of these ideas of when we build these new cities and when we expand older cities, how do we think about them? How do we think of density not just as we have these enclave developments, we have these high rises, but you also want to have the biggest factor shaping travel anywhere, including US cities, is this job housing. How do you achieve the job housing balance? It's not easy. It's one of the biggest challenges urban planners face in what they're doing. But some of the principles would be, actually, if you look at Indian cities right now, majority of trips are actually by walking and biking. So trips to work, more than 40 to 50% of trips to work in multiple cities. This was an excellent study done by Geetam Tiwari at IIT Delhi. And she's shown, I think she surveyed about 40 cities. This data is also available through the census. It's about 40 to 50% of trips to work are by walking and biking. And so when we think of new cities, we want to retain that, the type of access. So if you look at a lot of the service economy workers, they live in proximity. So the first thing is not to push peripheral slum development or peripheral housing for rehabilitation. You want in situ rehabilitation of folks in slums where they can access work and they can live in cities with a higher infrastructure access. The second is this idea of the rural-urban circular economy, and this broader question of what has allowed European urbanization and US urbanization to achieve those economic superlinearity, which we call superlinear growth. Some of the hypothesis has been that it was the breadbasket in the Midwest that supported New York City and Chicago. And therefore, both the Midwestern cities, smaller cities, and these big metropolitan areas both achieved economic gain, is what people are suggesting. And we could think about particularly food systems in that context in India, because all urban areas need food. And like I said, we've demonstrated this through Amul as a fantastic example of achieving both rural and urban and food security through these things. So I would point to those examples, and we could think further. There have been some explorations of distributed manufacturing using technology. That's a potential. Again, I think the beauty of urbanization in India and everywhere else is the amount of experimentation that's going on, both technological experimentation, social experimentation, institutional experimentation. And there's so many examples we could draw upon. The real question is identifying them, evaluating them, and how do we scale them at scale for the 400 million new urbanites that are there. So the circular economy concepts as well. I think already the Indian government, the Punjab government had an award for technologies that would reuse crop stubble instead of burning it. Those are kinds of examples where if you could take those technologies to scale, you would simultaneously address air pollution, you would address the rural-urban, create an urban economy, and you could also address the in-migration rates if you did this at scale so that we can address this.
Thank you. We had a question from Rahul Mehra, who is a past president of the Princeton Club of India. Rahul, can I request you to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Shiv. Thanks, Professor Anu, for doing this webinar. I know it's still early morning in America. Professor Anu, my question for you was, as sad as the migrant crisis is, with the internal exodus of millions, a perverse side effect of this is the decongestion of cities in India. Much is uncertain whether these migrants will ever come back. If this year's monsoons are good, they may be occupied, at least for the next few months, in their villages. Regardless of whether they come back or whether this exodus is temporary or permanent, what does this internal movement of millions out of major Indian cities mean for the future of the much touted Indian urbanization, considering that this morning's newspapers, I think it was Hindustan Times in India, said that a lot of the MMRDA projects, the Mumbai city projects, that's my hometown, such as building the metro rail, building urban infrastructure, is going to be delayed for several months, because now we are realizing that even the infrastructure of Bombay, using a case study from my hometown, was being built by these migrant workers. So what does this mean for the future of Indian cities and Indian urbanization that you've studied for the past so many decades? Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. And one that I think I partly alluded to. For folks to now come back to urban areas, I think one of the things, I think I said that major construction might have to guarantee or demonstrate that they can provide housing and these amenities that have been lacking previously. I was on another call with the World Resources Institute on a potential pharma city development in Andhra Pradesh. And this was raised actually by them, that as we build this new development, how can we think of attracting labor and this idea of providing labor, housing and amenities as part of development projects. I think it might be a good outcome of this because of the billions of migrants who were, the millions of migrants who were working in Indian cities. They might have, most of the travel, the motorized travel is not because of them. I mentioned to you, most of motorized travel, and if you're talking about traffic congestion, is not really from, it's from the people who own cars, who are not taking public transit or two-wheelers and so forth. And so when we talk about the migrants who are here, many of them don't have those vehicles. And we saw that, that's why they were struggling. And so I think thinking through how to do these big infrastructure projects that are equitable to the workers and provide that, I think is going to be important. And one option maybe is when we think of budgeting these projects, doing them in modular way, where distributed infrastructure comes in and can be modularly added up rather than thinking of massive centralized investments. It may be a way to think through this to address the labor challenge you're talking about.
Thank you for your.
As I said, these are options that have been discussed in other countries. There has to be experimentation in India. In many ways, India could experiment and lead the way out of this crisis because it's being faced in other countries as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Next, we have Dr. Niloy Sarkar. Dr. Sarkar, can I request you to come in?
Yeah, very good evening. Am I audible? Yeah, hi.
Yes,
so
I can
it's a wonderful
hear you.
presentation indeed, Dr. Anu. I just have one very simple question. There is no doubt that COVID has a lot of adverse effects on us. And you have mentioned lots, in your presentations. But do you think that there are some positive effects as well, maybe indirect, on our, especially for Indian peoples? Is there any?
Sorry, I couldn't follow the whole question. You said, are there positive effects? Is that the question?
Is there any positive effects as well? So maybe one of them you have already mentioned that the pollution has come down, drastically. It may not be a very lasting one, maybe for time being, but do you think that there are some positive effects as well on human being due to this, adverse effect of this COVID? Whether it will change our, lifestyle and there may be something, positive may happen, to our life.
Right. So I think the environment is one. On the positive side, again, this is also in US cities. People have rethinking what it means to have a good quality of life. Maybe more time at home has provided opportunities for hobbies like urban gardening. This is something that has increased much more in the US. Looking at what happens when you don't have traffic might stimulate people to walk or bike more. There's a lot more exercise, physical exercise in US cities, in parks, which is actually very beneficial for health. And I think broader than that is cities might build in resilience from this experience that could work for future events. Future shocks like this, it's sort of, even if the COVID returns, there's now some infrastructure, some knowledge gained. I think those are all interesting in terms of the benefits that you could get from, or some of the positive developments, and even things like slowing down the rate of urban immigration. Um, in the short run, yes, it may seem like it's difficult to get started on the economy when this has happened, and that's true. But it could also allow us to think about how do we achieve more balance in the way we were urbanizing by itself. But all of these examples have been raised in other cities too, particularly people exercising more, walking more, doing more of these activities because of the lockdown, and whether that memory will be retained not only by individuals but by corporations. Many corporations are now saying, as you might have read about it, Google, several large corporations are saying they may have a majority of their workforce working telecommuting. So this is affecting not only individuals, but how company cultures and work cultures might change in the future. Really, we don't know, but we're seeing where it might go and what might happen.
Yeah, I just, a few days back, I was talking with one of my friends, he's a doctor. And while we're discussing, his opinion is like that, today, as of now, we should say that before COVID, that droplet infection, that communicable diseases, the major source of infection is droplet infections. And if you see the statistics, almost, say, 10 to 15% are due to these droplet infections. But when there was a droplet, there was a communicable disease also before COVID, but we never used to use masks, So when we started using this mask, I think there will be a prevention, say, a kind of prevention of these droplet infections as well. So maybe COVID cases are coming up, but in some cases, maybe some other non-communicable diseases will come down. So that could be one of the things, but apart from that, we need to understand, that what could be the other opportunities. We need to search, what are the other opportunities out of this, adverse, situation. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
I agree. They also show statistics that flu, influenza has been much reduced, obviously because of, because of social distancing. Anecdotally, I've also heard that in many cities, the waste, this is all anecdotal. I would love to do a deeper study in India on this, but the waste sectors, the waste haulers, and many of our personnel who are handling waste by hand with their bare hands have been asking for gloves and protective equipment, which is great because this should have been there to begin with, but maybe this is the stimulus to do that even in our waste management sectors. So they could be benefits and lessons to be learned that could be positive. And I think the real question is, can we keep that memory as we recover and go forward?
We have a question from Shardul Prabhu. Shardul, if you can hear me,
Hello.
you can talk, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Ramaswamy, first of all, brilliant presentation. My question is that now that most of the migrants are back home, and keeping in mind that India is still primarily agrarian, So are there any particular type of jobs that need to be created and can be created in the near future to build back better, so to say? And will this in any way help strengthen our food supply chain? I remember the one of your slides.
Right. So that is the thesis. That's the proposal I'm making exactly. I just wanted to back up and say, we're not actually majority agrarian. This depends on how you count urban, and there's some debate on how we count urban, because what is urban is defined differently in different countries. But if we looked at other definitions of urban, and if we looked at I use this background where you can see cities. I don't know if you can see cities behind me through night lights. I use this background because it helps me explain global urban systems. And if you use nightlight imagery, actually much more of India would be considered urban than we count using our, definition of urban. If you look at agglomerations, much more of India is urban than we recognize. So I just wanted to put that out first. And then the second is that this idea of this, what can we incentivize in rural areas, and how do we incentivize it differently? We've always had rural development programs, but how do we think of the urban-rural supply chains, I think is a very fruitful area of thought. And that's the issue. I mentioned Amul because Amul did that very strategically, and thinking that through across other products that are becoming popular, but thinking about it and combining it with waste to energy, distributed infrastructure, will provide infrastructure in rural areas that could really change the dynamic. I think eventually we'll probably still have 400 million urban residents, but the type of urbanization will be different. Instead of large, fast movement to these big cities, which are already stressed, we could see different patterns. And this is all a hypothesis, but I think that's why doing some pilot projects and experimenting is really valuable. And you're right, there is a large agricultural sector, and combining that with food processing would get you SMEs involved in the food value chain, and then you can create some of those value-added products. And addressing energy and waste creates different types of entrepreneurship opportunities.
Dr. Ramaswamy, we next have the immediate past president of the Indian Chamber, Rudra Chatterjee. And although he's from Colombia, we'll still let him talk.
Thanks, Siddhant. Fantastic talk, Dr. Ramaswamy. I was, while there's lots of, positives, the big concern is that data point where you said that GDP growth rises faster than population growth. And now we are talking about depopulation from urban areas, alongside an estimated GDP reduction of 5 to 10%, across economies. So this can be exacerbated with depopulation and urbanization. So that seems like an incredibly scary prospect to any member of our chamber. So how bad do you think this depopulation of urban areas would be, and how permanent do you think this would be?
Right. Well, I can send you some more literature on this, but the point here is that Indian urbanization was already not seeing the super linear growth that other urbanizations saw. So in that sense, yes, the loss of population will have an impact on GDP, but comparatively, it may not have as much of an impact for the reason I just said, that Indian urbanization and in some other parts of the world, this is not just India, are not seeing the typical vision of urbanization we have. When we think of London and what happened in China is a different case because it's very managed urbanization. But when you think of the US and European urbanization, the story always has been, we created wealth, the wealth increased, and that creates more attraction for people to come to urban areas, and you have urbanization levels that are exceeding 80%. But that isn't necessarily happening in other parts of the world. For example, in South America, in India, and so my point being, we weren't as super linear as other urbanization experiences have been. And the second being, it's the self-reliance or the Swadeshi. If you were to take that concept to apply around urban areas or large urban areas, medium-sized urban areas, you could think of urban rural more as a partnership, as a continuum, rather than thinking of that primary urban center, to think of new ways of invigorating the economy. But what you're talking about, this type of GDP shock, is going to happen worldwide. I think the way to stimulate it is going to be different in different countries. And here urbanization is an interesting intersection because of the threshold that India is crossing right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. Dr. Ramaswamy, I don't know how you are on time.
Yeah, I'm good for about 5 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so we have one question real quick from Mr. Rajesh Rai Singhani, who's in the amusement park and leisure business. So the question he wanted to know was, how do you see the future of, entertainment parks, shopping malls, which all had a lot of crowding? Is that, going to be sustainable, or, how can we figure out how to live with entertainment options where people can socialize again?
Right. So this is not my area of specialization, but I could anecdotally say that I've seen some technologies that have been talked about in the news and in news articles in New York City. And one of them and I don't know how effective this is, but I think I'll say 2 or 3 things. I think first of all, if people have to have confidence that they can meet again in larger groups, we have to have some sort of testing to make sure that you can track hotspots. So in that recovery, some of that is going to be in many countries that have come back, that has been an ingredient. I think it's going to be very difficult to do that for our large population, but I may be wrong. I think that's why Arogya Setu, some of these digital contact tracing, if they can tackle the privacy concerns, could actually allow India to experiment with a different way of thinking about creating that confidence that if there's exposure, there's a way to limit it, there's a way of identifying it. I mentioned that in the US, people are looking at wastewater, and the logic being that the virus sheds before the person shows symptoms, and so this idea of sampling wastewater is something that has been proposed and is actually being actively investigated. Again, I think that may not translate as well for the reason I mentioned, that not many of our cities, there are populations, large populations that do not have access to sewer systems. But I just wanted to say this one idea, this thought that if we knew where the hotspots are or where infection is growing, and if we knew that we could manage it, that gives confidence. The second aspect is trying to zap the virus. And I've seen some of these. I don't know what the technology behind them is, but they're like a UV light that you pass through a threshold. It's sort of walking through the security system at airports or in schools. And it's supposed to zap the virus. It's being tested. I've only seen it anecdotally, but there may be those types of things. And the third is to understand how COVID is different in India. I mentioned some of the reasons people have talked about. Our population distribution is different. We have fewer very old people, older population in our demographics. So I think that there's many other thoughts about how do we think about this, who do we quarantine, who do we protect, how do we protect? It's really complex. But I think people would have to have the confidence to come back.
That's interesting. In fact, one of the issues being proposed is that policy should move to a kind of a hyper-local policy. And so that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Two last questions that are somewhat aligned. I'll just read out to save some time. It's from Arun Hardikar, and he talks about, is it practical to restrict, cities to, say, a 10 million population and promote smaller cities like Livingston and Secaucus, who are your neighbors in New Jersey. Related question is there for Mr. Kapil Mohan, who's from the government of Karnataka, and he's talking about how we can do the urban development, which has also been a topic in various Niti Aayog forums. So it's a familiar concept, and I think you've talked about it somewhat. And the last question, which you talked about in your environment, but is the environment which you talked about, but you didn't let us know really what your policy prescriptions are. And the question is from Samantha Chai. How do we make sure these environmental gains that we've seen can actually be sustained? And I think those are the last three questions we'll trouble you with today.
So I think the first two are somewhat related. If you look at urbanization in any country, you don't always have only these mega cities. You always have a distribution of cities, and there's a law called Spiff's law, which has empirically looked at what is the distribution of cities by size. And so, unless you actually made policies to promote much larger cities, you will naturally get a distribution of cities that are of different population sizes. The World Bank has done some studies giving some guidance, and I'm at a later point I can give you some of these resources. But the World Bank has done some studies suggesting which type of manufacturing do you encourage. So if you have a mega city, you may want to encourage sort of cleaner, not heavy manufacturing, but cleaner manufacturing industries. And then where do you invest in the big sort of heavy manufacturing and versus niche manufacturing? And how do you think of supply chains so that you create the ecosystem? So there is literature on that, but what I was saying is even naturally cities are going to be of different sizes. And here you're thinking about how can I address the environmental problem or challenge with the city size challenge. So that's one, thinking about what type of manufacturing you encourage in different city sizes. The second, I think we've spoken quite a bit about rural urban. I truly think we've done these examples in India in many ways. The only way to really is to have pilot projects that are evaluated. I'd be really happy to collaborate on any of these pilots if that's of interest, and think of what that rural urban interactions would be. It would require understanding, for example, if you're setting an industrial park, what are the materials that are needed for that industrial park? Can we stimulate an economy around it? That would be an example where you would get the industry activity, which speaks to your secondary economy, and you have primary activity around it, or even small and medium enterprises that work together. And I think the last question was policy prescription. And I mean, policy is good if you can enforce it and track it. And so I think one of my policy comments, and this is true everywhere, is it's always going to be a mix of multi-sector. It has to be a mix of engagement with the public to promote this public awareness of their own activities, their own lifestyle, with regulation and with companies, also voluntarily exploring many of these options. And I think, to me, that's the governance challenge. So I think thinking about governance that brings these three sectors together, maybe again in one or two case study cities, and says, how can we think of these environmental gains by concretely working together and then coming up with an action plan that is implemented with measurable outputs. And again, India is already doing this for air pollution. There's the Knowledge Network. There are new programs where funding is being provided by international agencies to cities to demonstrate actual reductions tied to funding. And those would be policy examples where you can see outcomes related to your actions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I now request the CEO and the Secretary General, Dr. Rajiv Singh, to conclude our session for today?
Thank you, Dr. Ramaswamy. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank you. I think we had a great session, plenty of takeaways. The only regret we have is we were all set to see you at Princeton in the month of April, but due to COVID, we could not go ahead. However, we are keen to meet you depending on the COVID soon. And as a chamber, I think for us also there are plenty of takeaways from your address today. And we would like to work on some of those. And once again, I would like to thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much. I welcome you back to Princeton when we're out of this. And I also would love to visit with you in India and maybe take some of these ideas forward jointly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been a busy time. Exams are just over. I'm sure you have some grading to do. And in the middle of all that, thanks for spending this morning of yours.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.